The night was quiet, the streets bathed in the glow of dim streetlights, when a scene unfolded that no one could have predicted. A police officer with authority stitched into his uniform believed he had complete control over the situation. He stopped a black woman, assuming she was just another citizen he could intimidate. But in that single moment, when he decided to cross a line he should never have crossed, when his boot struck her with cruel force, he had no idea that this woman was not only prepared to defend herself but was also one of the most highly trained individuals in the country. What he thought would be an easy display of power quickly became the beginning of his downfall. Welcome everyone to Tailcraft. If you're visiting for the very first time, I want to say thank you for joining us. Here we dive into real, powerful, and often shocking stories that leave us questioning the world we live in. And if you find yourself gripped by today's story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with others, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale we bring to life. Now let me ask you this. What happens when prejudice blinds someone so badly that they fail to recognize the strength standing right in front of them? That very question sits at the heart of today's story. This story begins like so many others. A traffic stop, a confrontation, an officer's voice hardened by arrogance. But unlike many stories that end with injustice and silence, this one takes a different turn. Because the woman he chose to disrespect, to harm, and to humiliate was not just a victim, she was an FBI agent. And she wasn't about to let her identity, her dignity, or her safety be erased by the actions of a single hateful man. Why does this matter? Because what unfolded that night is more than just a clash between a cop and a citizen. It's a lesson about judgment, prejudice, and the dangers of wielding authority without accountability. Every time a story like this emerges, it forces us to ask hard questions. How much longer will we tolerate abuse of power? How often do people suffer in silence when the world isn't watching? And what happens when, finally, the tables turn, and those who misuse power find themselves facing someone stronger, smarter, and unwilling to back down? The moment the officer's boot landed was meant to degrade her, to send a message that he was in control. But the truth was he had just ignited a firestorm. He assumed she was defenseless. He assumed she was powerless. He assumed wrong. And those assumptions, fueled by racism and arrogance, would be the very things that cost him his badge, his reputation, and his career. In today's video we'll walk you through everything that happened. The encounter, the shocking act of violence, the powerful moment when the FBI agent revealed who she was, and the fallout that changed the officer's life forever. This isn't just a story about one cop and one woman, it's a reflection of a much bigger issue, one that continues to plague communities and divide trust between those who enforce the law and those who live under it. So buckle up. What you're about to hear is not only gripping but also deeply important. It's a story of strength meeting arrogance, of justice answering prejudice, and of one woman's courage turning a moment of violence into a turning point for accountability. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll see exactly why this officer lost everything the moment he decided to raise his foot. The night was cool, the highway nearly empty, when flashing red and blue lights suddenly lit up the rearview mirror of a black motorcycle. The rider, a black woman in her late 30s, eased her bike onto the shoulder. Calm, steady, and collected, she had been through countless high-stress situations in her career, though this was supposed to be just a quiet ride home. She removed her helmet, placed it on the seat, and kept her hands visible on the handlebars. She knew how these moments could spiral quickly. What she didn't know was just how far this particular officer was willing to take it. The officer approached with heavy steps, his flashlight beam cutting across her face. His tone was sharp, not one of courtesy or procedure, but of command dripping with disdain. License and registration. Now. She nodded, keeping her movements deliberate, slow, and visible, reaching into her jacket pocket. Yet, before she could even hand over her identification, he barked again. "Why are you out here at this hour? Don't you know this area isn't safe?" The implication wasn't about safety at all, it was layered with suspicion, with a tone that made clear he saw her as a problem before he ever saw her as a person. The woman answered calmly, her voice measured. "I'm just heading home from work, officer. Everything is in order." She handed over her documents, expecting the routine check to follow. But instead of taking them, the officer smirked and let his flashlight wander, inspecting her motorcycle, then her jacket, then her skin. The silence stretched before he spoke again, his words sharp as a blade. "People like you think you can go anywhere, huh?" His gaze locked on her and she knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about control, about reminding her where he thought she belonged. The tension thickened. She kept her composure, reminding herself of her training. De-escalation was the first tool always. "Officer," she began, keeping her voice steady, "I've complied with everything you asked. If you'll just run the check, we can both be on our way." But her professionalism, her calmness, it only seemed to irritate him more. He leaned closer, his jaw tight, muttering under his breath, "Don't tell me how to do my job." And then, as if to prove something neither of them had challenged, he snatched the license from her hand with a jerk, the kind designed to unsettle, to provoke. She steadied herself, refusing to flinch. But what happened next shattered any illusion of this being a simple stop. Without warning, the officer shoved her shoulder with one hand, stepping into her space. "Get off the bike," he ordered. When she asked, "Am I under arrest?" his answer came not in words but in violence. With a sudden motion he kicked her leg hard, knocking her off balance. Her body hit the pavement, gravel scraping her palms as she caught herself. Pain shot through her side, but more than that, a wave of anger surged. Anger that he had crossed a line so blatant, so reckless, that there could be no turning back. The officer stood over her, his hand resting on his holster as if daring her to move. The arrogance in his eyes told her everything. He thought he had already won. He thought she was another person with no defense, someone too afraid to push back. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. Beneath her calm exterior was a woman forged through years of service, hardened by training and backed by a badge of her own. She was no ordinary citizen lying on that road. She was an FBI agent, and his ignorance had just placed him in a storm he couldn't control. For a moment she took a deep breath, steadying herself on one knee. The decision before her was clear. She could reveal her identity immediately, halt this madness, and end it with words, or she could hold back, watch how far he was willing to go, and ensure that every mistake he made would cost him dearly when the truth came out. The officer tapped his boot against the ground, smirking down at her, assuming submission. But instead of breaking, she looked up at him with fire in her eyes. That was the instant everything shifted. This wasn't his power anymore. It was hers. The silence after the shove hung heavy in the air, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars. The officer loomed over her, confident that his display of force had cowed her into submission. But what he failed to see was the fire kindling in her chest, the quiet storm forming behind her calm eyes. She wasn't just another woman pulled over on the roadside, she was someone trained to deal with threats far greater than this. She had faced war zones, stood against armed criminals, and worked covert operations where one wrong move meant death. Compared to that, he was nothing. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, dusting the gravel from her palms. Her voice, when it came, was calm but firm, carrying an authority that cut sharper than any shout. "Officer," she said, locking eyes with him, "you just made the biggest mistake of your career." For the first time that night, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected fear, compliance, maybe even tears, but not confidence, not defiance. The badge on his chest suddenly felt less like armor and more like a weight dragging him down. He tried to mask his hesitation with bluster, his hand tightening around his belt as he barked, "You're resisting a lawful order." But his words rang hollow, and deep down he knew it. She straightened her posture, every movement precise, calculated, the stance of someone who knew how to take control of a confrontation. Then, with deliberate clarity, she pulled a small leather wallet from her jacket pocket. She flipped it open, the gold and blue emblem gleaming under his flashlight. FBI. Her credentials shone like a blade cutting through his arrogance, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The officer's face drained of color. His jaw clenched, but the shift in his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't dealing with a civilian anymore, he was dealing with someone who outranked him in every way that mattered. She stepped closer, her badge still displayed, her tone now sharp as steel. "I gave you every chance to do the right thing," she said. "Instead you assaulted me. Do you have any idea what that means?" Each word landed like a hammer, breaking apart the fragile wall of authority he had tried to build. His breathing quickened and sweat gathered at his temples. Still, pride clung to him like a parasite. "Badge or not," he spat, "you don't tell me how to do my job." But the conviction in his voice faltered. She tilted her head slightly, almost pitying him. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not abuse and humiliate. You think that badge gives you power over people like me? Wrong. It's supposed to give people trust. But you've turned it into a weapon of hate. And now, you're going to answer for it." Her words weren't shouted, yet they carried more force than any raised voice could muster. The road felt colder now, the flashing lights harsher, as the reality of the situation pressed down on him. She pulled out her phone, her movements steady and deliberate. "You assaulted a federal agent, officer. That's a felony. I'm giving you one chance to step back before this gets worse. Her thumb hovered over the screen, ready to dial. The name she would call wasn't a local department, it was the Bureau itself. He knew what that meant. Internal affairs, federal investigations, career-ending charges. For the first time he saw the edge of the cliff he had walked himself onto. But she wasn't finished. She leaned in, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You thought I was powerless? You thought I'd be easy to break because of the color of my skin, because I was alone on this road? But let me tell you something, I've stared down enemies more dangerous than you and I've never backed down. You picked the wrong woman tonight. Her eyes locked with his, unflinching, unwavering. In that moment the balance of power shifted completely. The officer, once so sure of his dominance, now stood exposed. His arrogance shattered, his authority stripped away. The officer's hands twitched nervously at his sides as the woman's phone lit up, its glow cutting through the darkness of the roadside. She pressed a single button and within moments, a voice answered on the other end, calm, professional, and authoritative. Agent, are you safe? The question carried weight. She spoke clearly, detailing the officer's actions, the stop without cause, the shove, the threats. Her tone was controlled, but beneath it was a razor edge of anger. Every word she uttered was now part of a record, every detail documented in real time. The officer knew, his world was crumbling. As she ended the call, the officer shifted on his feet, his swagger replaced by unease. He tried to bark an order, put that phone away. But his voice cracked under the strain, betraying his fear. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her jacket pocket and folded her arms. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in her dark eyes, making them burn with a quiet fire. For the first time, the officer seemed smaller than the uniform he wore, like a child playing dress-up with power he didn't deserve. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter, closer. The officer turned, his stomach nodding as two sleek black SUVs rolled up and stopped with calculated precision. Their doors opened in perfect sync, and out stepped men and women in plain clothes, their movements sharp and deliberate. They didn't need sirens, they didn't need to shout, the weight of their presence was enough. The officer recognized them instantly. Federal agents. Reinforcements. His pulse quickened, his throat dry. He was no longer in control. The female agent greeted her colleagues with a nod, her voice calm. I'm fine. But this officer isn't. She gestured toward him, her tone measured but cutting. He stopped me without cause, assaulted me, and attempted to intimidate me. He thought my badge meant nothing. The agents turned their eyes toward him, their gazes heavy and unyielding. It wasn't just one person judging him now, it was a circle of authority, law, and accountability closing in, suffocating his arrogance. He tried to open his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. One agent stepped forward, his voice low and controlled. Officer, do you realize what you've done? You assaulted a federal agent. That alone is a career-ending move. But add in the misconduct, the racial profiling, your department's going to be torn apart by this. The words struck like hammer blows, each one driving the officer further into panic. He looked around wildly as though searching for an escape, but there was none. The road, once his stage for control, had become a courtroom where his crimes were laid bare. Still, desperation clawed at him. I didn't know who she was, he stammered. I was just doing my job. But the female agent's laugh was sharp, humorless. Your job? Your job is to uphold the law, not abuse it. You didn't care who I was when you shoved me. You cared about control. You cared about power. And now that power is gone. Her words sliced through the night, leaving him stripped of excuses. Every second dragged him deeper into the hole he had dug with his arrogance and prejudice. The agents moved closer, surrounding the officer with quiet authority. His hands trembled as he finally raised them, surrendering not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. The woman he thought was powerless had turned the tables entirely, and now he was the one cornered, his fate sealed. The female agent looked at him one last time, her eyes steady, her voice resolute. You thought I was your victim. But tonight, you've learned the difference between authority and abuse. And the lesson will cost you everything. The officer was finally taken aside, his badge and weapon removed under the watchful eyes of federal agents. The night air felt heavier, quieter now, as if even the street had absorbed the gravity of what had just happened. The female FBI agent stood tall, her calm demeanor never breaking. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out in rage, yet she had dismantled every ounce of prejudice and arrogance thrown at her. It wasn't just about one stop or one shove, It was about the unshakable truth that abuse of power can never outlast real authority. As the SUVs pulled away with the disgraced officer in tow, the agent finally exhaled, a small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For her, this wasn't just personal victory, it was a stand for every person who had been stopped, searched, or humiliated without cause. It was for those whose voices were silenced, whose rights were trampled because someone in uniform forgot what those uniforms were meant to represent. Tonight, justice wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. And justice had a face, a name, and a badge she had earned with honor. This story is more than a clash on a roadside, it's a reminder. A reminder that character reveals itself in moments of power. Some use authority to protect, while others weaponize it to dominate. The officer believed his badge gave him control. The agent knew her badge gave her responsibility. That difference is what separates tyranny from justice, arrogance from honor. And when those lines are crossed, accountability must follow. Because in the end, power without principle collapses under its own weight. So, what do we take away from this? We take away that silence in the face of injustice is not an option. We take away that courage isn't always loud. It can be calm, deliberate, and steady. And we take away that real strength comes not from abusing others but from standing for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable. The female agent's story echoes beyond that roadside. It challenges each of us to see where we stand when wrong tries to disguise itself as authority. And now I turn it to you. What would you have done if you were in her place, or standing on that street watching it unfold? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Tailcraft for more powerful stories that shine a light on truth and justice. Until next time, remember this: injustice only wins when good people stay silent, so never be silent.